Welcome everybody to the Configure It Done podcast. In the last 6 months, we've got a new theme of the podcast, which is around S4 do's and don'ts. We've had some fantastic feedback from the market from the first 4 podcasts. We've actually got a live podcast coming up as well, where we interview Bruce McKinnon. But Seb, you've brought along a fantastic guest today, and I know we've got a specific theme that we're going to concentrate on around the S4 do's and don'ts theme.
Yeah, exactly. And thanks, Jay, for kind of highlighting that. I brought on Daivd Brennan, who's no stranger to digital transformations, having worked at a large number of big programs, was worked with HCL, IBM, RSCV, and now obviously finally Swinburne University, where he's the finance director for a major transformation there as well. So, Daivd, I think probably what would be good for all of our viewers now is just to understand a little bit more about your history and give you just kind of a short bio of kind of how you've come into the SAP world.
Yeah, thanks, Seb and Jay, for the introduction, and also thanks for the opportunity to share some of my learnings and experience with the wider audience.
Welcome to the new and improved Configure It Done podcast. The Configure It Done podcast is now a place where we interview senior thought leaders in the SAP space across Australia and New Zealand, and the aim is to tap into their knowledge so we can pass on their insights to the listening SAP community. Please subscribe to the podcast and like, share and comment across Castos, YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
This podcast is in partnership with the Black Dog Institute, who aim to create a mentally healthier world for everyone. If you wish to donate to the cause, please click the link below.
I think you're right. It's a good opportunity for me just to provide some background. My background from a functional perspective is finance. I've worked in a number of finance roles through my career, including CFO roles. Mm-hmm. About 10 years ago now, I got involved in being the finance lead at Lion, the big beer company based out of Sydney, for their significant S4HANA transformation. So whilst this is a relatively different career path for me over the last 10 years, it's really built on the solid foundations from finance. And I think those finance skills and background really help you deliver successful transformation programs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's great. Thanks, Seb. I was just going to start with what I actually define as transformation and what are the key components.
Sure.
I know this is predominantly around SAP S4HANA, but taking a step back, a successful transformation involves delivering transformation across people, your processes, and finally your technology as well. So again, I understand technology is a key enabler of these program of work, but it's also important that you make sure you support and encourage people through the process and actually understand your underlying business processes as well. I'm sorry, Seb, to jump in there.
No, that's perfect. That actually brings me quite nicely to the next question. We've obviously had quite a few discussions around kind of your digital transformation background, obviously your finance background as well. Before we kind of dive into vendors and solutions, we talked about a very interesting topic before we actually started thinking about, getting this podcast in. And that was from day 0 to commencement of delivery phase for a successful project. Now, what crucial groundwork should organizations complete to ensure they're truly ready for a transformation program?
Yeah, thanks for that, Seb. So I'm going to start with some context. All programs will be structured differently, but if you break an overall larger program into 3 phases, you've got your initiation phase, you've got your planning phase, and then you've got what's called the delivery phase, where you've got the system integrator and your all systems go to deliver the transformation. As you mentioned, we're really going to talk here around what happens on day 0 to get you to that delivery phase. So in a number of my roles, I've come into organizations whether it's due to changes in technology, changes in business practices, or just a desire for compliance reasons to deliver a transformation. But a lot of organizations are really struggling just to know where to start. But what I was going to talk about are some of the key lessons I've learned in the context of where to start. So the first thing I'd call out is it's really important to define some clear objectives and scope. So this is really about establishing specific, measurable goals that outline what the transformation aims to achieve. This helps align stakeholders and provides a clear direction. I mean, it sounds pretty obvious, but where you start is actually trying to understand what are you trying to achieve from transformation
Yeah.
And also importantly, what are you not going to deliver as part of the transformation as well? That dovetails nicely into the next one, which is around really engaging your key stakeholders. Through the initiation phase, this will be mainly with your C-level execs, so your CEO, CFO, and your Chief Technology Officer. And we'll come back a bit later to looking at those relationships in a bit more detail. But it's really important that you engage with these stakeholders, ensuring that they both have input this initial phase, but also they have buy-in as well. Everyone's really clear on what the program is trying to achieve, and make sure that everyone's aligned with what a successful implementation looks like. The next one I'm going to speak about is around a change management strategy. So if you think of the technologies that are being delivered now, whether that's SAP or any other software vendors, they're predominantly cloud-based technologies, which are generally standard-based solutions. What that means is organisations have to really support their teams and their people through this change management strategy. An interesting statistic is where large projects fail, particularly transformation projects, in 70% of those cases, it's around lack of user engagement. So it just highlights the key and the importance of making sure you have a clear change management strategy, and that change management strategy is documented and articulated as part of the initiation phase. The next stage is around allocating resources. So it's important that people are allocated to the program very early on. And again, I'll speak to structures a bit later, but generally that will be with a program director, certainly a functional expert or more functional experts if it's a fully end-to-end transformation program. And then finally, you'll need technology expertise as well, which we'll also discuss in more detail. And then finally, you'll need the support of the PMO in the context of providing business analysts to document both your requirements and your business processes as well. So they're just some of the key things to set a program up. The final one is around setting some metrics for success. Whether it's timing, whether it's spend, whether it's outcomes, making sure those stakeholders I spoke to earlier are all aligned on what a successful program looks like and what are the key metrics that the program or the transformation journey will be measured against.
Yeah. So, Daivd, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of key areas. And what I want to focus on, I think you said it earlier around C-level, the CEO, CFO, CTO. What role do they specifically play in the early stages to set the project up for success?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jay. So the CFO is really their key responsibility, as I've seen it, is to deliver that vision and leadership. So what does vision and leadership actually means? That means the CEO should articulate a clear vision of the ERP project, and importantly, it needs to be aligned with the organisation's strategic goals as well. So they can't be working in contradiction to each other. The next one is around the CFO. And having been a CFO myself, I understand the importance of this role. And this is really ensuring the primary job of the CFO in the transformation journey is to ensure that there's sufficient resources allocated for the project. Mm-hmm. So they need to help the business prioritise, because there's always demand for funding on other projects, but the CFO has a primary responsibility to make sure there's accurate resource allocation for the project. Mm-hmm. Certainly the other C-suite executive that's really important is around the CTO, so your Chief Technology Officer. So they're really important in making sure that they understand how the ERP will sit with the current systems landscape, and in particular how it will help integrate into the legacy systems that invariably will still be remaining once the ERP has been transformed as well. Mm-hmm. So a combination of those three senior executives will really help set a program up for success into the delivery phase.
Thanks, Daivd. I think that kind of brings us into a nice dovetail into the next part, because I think you mentioned, right, you need to have a strong team behind you. How do you typically recommend organizations structure their internal team during those early stages? Because you mentioned before, right, early stages is you need to have that groundwork done properly beforehand for that project to be successful. So how would you recommend kind of businesses go about structuring their internal teams?
Yeah, and I suppose emphasising that every business will be structured slightly differently, but allowing for that, there's certainly the model I've used across a number of different organisations now. Starts with the steering committee or a project review board or any other acronym that you'll hear. I think everyone understands what that means. That is the senior executives, the number of which we've already spoken to. I'd also probably include your head of architecture, your PMO head, and other similar people with skills, certainly in the context of setting up a steering committee. And then that would flow into what I call a stakeholder advisory group. The acronym I've used in the past is SAG. And that's really in the context of going that next level down to the heart of an organisation to make sure those people are aligned with what the change is looking to deliver. And then finally, there's the project team. So there's the project director, and then there'll be a number of different functions within that. There'll be functional lead or functional leads. There'll be your technology team, whether it's a technology lead and a program architect. And then you'll have change and also data as well. And I will speak a bit more about data later, but it's important that you start addressing data very early on. So you need to structure that team with a clear governance framework, clear roles and responsibilities documented, and a clear meeting cadence so decisions can be made promptly to move the program forward as it moves into the delivery phase.
So that data piece, it keeps coming up, multiple podcasts, change management and data. But when we met before, Daivd, we got some really good notes and areas that you wanted to focus on. And one of the things that came up was essential components of a solid program roadmap and a governance model as well. But basically, what's established before formal project kickoff with solid program roadmap and governance model?
Yes, as I spoke to earlier, setting up those roles and responsibilities in particular. So, for example, for your steering committee, making sure they're very clear on the roles and responsibilities. So they can include things like status updates, scope changes, or certainly scope documentation. The other thing to call out is making sure that key risks, actions and decisions are clearly documented, articulated and escalated where appropriate. And then that flows into your stakeholder advisory group, where there are those little working sessions to raise these issues up to your steerco level as well.
I think one of the interesting things you were talking about there, especially when we're talking about the organizational piece, right? And a lot of the time you have customers that look around, okay, what's their system landscape look like and how do they build a compelling business case? And you talked about it there. We talked about, the setting up of the team, setting up obviously the early stages. But what do you think organizations can pretty much build a compelling business case for transformation? How do they normally kind of assess their current system landscapes? Because you've got a lot of different strategies, you've got a lot of different things to kind of contend with, right? How do you kind of, clear out all the noise?
Yeah, so the important thing is, and probably something I've learned over the last 10 years in transformation roles, is the importance of your system architect. So most organizations, as we know, are very busy doing their day-to-day activities. So just taking a step back and actually documenting what is firstly your current systems landscape. So how does everything work together? Because everyone knows in certainly more complex organizations, there's lots, if not tens, there can be hundreds of integrations that occur every day to make sure that the day-to-day business keeps going. So firstly is actually taking the time to document and understand your current systems landscape. And that's typically put onto a systems architecture map or certainly a systems architecture document, which visually explains how everything fits together, but then documents that in a written form as well. And then you move into your conceptual systems architecture. So when you roll out the transformation and the new ERP, what will the landscape look in sort of 2-3 years? So what I mean by that is the ERP will still be at the heart of your architecture, but a number of those legacy systems will be potentially subsumed into your new ERP. There'll be a number of legacy integrations that still remain, and you then have to understand exactly how you're going to design those integrations, because invariably those integrations are using old technology or certainly older technology, and those integrations will need to be rebuilt or redesigned. So it's key that you also have a systems integration strategy that's vitally important to making sure everything works going forward.
Brilliant. So up to now, this is a lot of information, a lot of content, and obviously ground zero up until delivery. Again, there'll be a lot of stakeholders and the broader business, and again, there's a lot of people to consider. But communication, I want to focus on that point Daivd, like how can an organization effectively communicate when you've got so many different stakeholders, and then obviously you've got to consider the broader business as well. But during those early days, how would you recommend effectively communicating?
Yeah, so that governance structure I've spoken to is part of that process, but certainly that's not the only communication route. I think the very first thing is to develop a comprehensive communications plan. So very early on, you need the support or need to get some resources across change management and communication.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about developing a plan. Now, your plan will change and probably get more detailed as you go through the life of the transformation journey, but even just understanding how you expect to communicate. And by how, you can use a number of different forums. I think we all get hundreds of emails every day, so I wouldn't necessarily suggest just sending out emails. What I would certainly support is the program director or the equivalent using things like town hall meetings, larger team meetings to firstly present where the transformation journey is looking to go, but then to allow plenty of time for question and answers and concerns. Because it's really important that people both get the opportunity to give their input, but also be seen to have had that opportunity to input to the program as well. That's really important, not only deliver your message, but also take messages back via two-way communication. The other thing I'd call out from a comms perspective is we all know these transformation journeys can be long. They can be arduous. So it's really important that from a program perspective, certainly any early wins and early achievements are celebrated. Now, you don't want to go over the top with that, but even when it's, for example, completing, documenting requirements, documenting process maps, it's important that people understand the progress the project is making initially, and then how that fits in with the longer term vision as well. So it's really important that not only you celebrate those early wins, but also communicate them as well. So that's certainly what I've seen in the context of effective communication. And the final point I'd make is it's just important to maintain that ongoing communication through the life of the program as well.
And do you think, because you talked about small wins there, and I kind of wanted to dive in a little bit more on that. When you say small wins, how would you typically celebrate small wins?
I think firstly, there's within the team. So keeping the team motivated over one of these long journeys is important as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's particularly just calling out, celebrating some key achievements. So, for example, it can be where you've completed documenting requirements.
Yeah.
It can be where you've completed documenting current business processes. It can be where you've got the RFP out the door, certainly in the first case, to the software vendors. So it's important that you celebrate these as you would any BAU successes, whether that's by things such as, team call-outs, team lunches, team dinners, anything like that are the ways I tend to celebrate those successes.
I think it's a really good point, and you've hit on, because we have the same thing in our company as well. We celebrate small successes. We chat to each other in our teams groups. We'll say, when something's gone well, and it keeps the motivation, right? It keeps the motivation, especially when times are tough, or for example, in a really long time project. So I think it kind of segues quite nicely, because especially when you're looking at difficult projects, you need to have a lot of communication. You need to have a lot of small wins as well to get people and keep people motivated. Now, one of the things that I've seen a lot in projects as well, and you'll probably be able to attest to this as well, is that sometimes key stakeholders aren't involved in the early stages or the early discussions. How would you recommend structuring those kind of initial conversations with the key stakeholders at the beginning of a project?
I think I'd even build that out. So I've already spoken to the importance of your CEO, your CFO, your Chief Technology Officer. I think we've also spoken quite a bit around the people side, so whether that's a HR or a transformation director. So I think it's important not only to have those initial discussions and get their initial buy-in, but certainly in the projects I've managed, I have at least fortnightly catch-ups with those key stakeholders as well. And even in between, when I have formal catch-ups at Steerco or stakeholder advisory groups, I quite often just send them emails to keep them updated of any key developments as well. So I think I spoke to earlier the importance of ongoing communication. So I think that's really important, but that can take a number of different forms as well.
For sure.
Excellent. And one thing I want to focus on now, Daivd, is we've had this from previous podcasts as well. So Adrian Fernando spoke about this, and it's the initial building a business case. When you are initially building a business case, what would be your recommendations for key critical factors, when building it, other than obviously the obvious technical requirements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing is making sure the business case and the transformation program more broadly aligns with the organisation's strategic goals. Because given the size of most of these transformation programs, boards tend to have to sign these off. It's very important that the board understands how this fits in with the organisation's strategic goals, or alternatively any other metrics that help address, for example, any compliance risk as well.
Yeah,
it's the first thing I'd pull out. You then spoke to your financials as well. But given that my background is finance, I understand the importance of doing a cost-benefit analysis. Now, the obvious big buckets of costs are around the program costs. The other ones I'd call out would be your ongoing maintenance cost of your existing platform versus a SaaS-based platform, which should hopefully be a lot cheaper and deliver those benefits. It's important that particularly the board and the program do a risk assessment. So understand what risks is the program addressing and what are those program risks and how can they be mitigated. It's important to note from a board perspective, any transformation is going to have a degree of risk, but it's how you mitigate those risks and make sure the board are fully aware of what those risks are. It's also important for the board to understand the limitations of existing systems as well. So I've spoken to a compliance amongst others. I think we're all aware of some deadlines approaching in the SAP ECC technology world as well. So limitations of existing infrastructure as well is very important. And it's also making sure everyone understands that even with the new ERP, how that aligns with your legacy systems. And we've spoken to integrations before as well.
And typically, I mean, what common mistakes do you normally see organizations make during that kind of phase? So you built your business case, you're now going to contract negotiation, you're at that point of the project. I think a lot of customers typically find that part quite tricky, and it can be quite difficult to navigate. So what typical mistakes do you normally see organizations making around that time?
Certainly as you start moving forward, let's assume for a moment your business case has been approved and then you've moved into the vendor selection process. It's really about making sure you've set solid foundations before you interact with your software vendors, as an example. So what do I mean by solid foundation? That means you're very clear and have documented your business requirements. So that's clearly documented and articulated. You've done your market research. So again, appreciating this is primarily spoken about, talking about SAP, but obviously there's other software vendors that Gartner talk about as well. So it's understanding the pros and cons of those different software vendors. You then move to the process of creating a shortlist. So to then respond to your question about common mistakes, a shortlist is called a shortlist for a reason. So you don't want to have a shortlist that has 10 or 15 different software vendors on it. So I think it's very important to start prioritizing your engagement externally. Then you can move into the formal process, which is either moving into an RFI, so a request for information, or an RFP. So making sure they're well-structured document that give you the right level of visibility for the requirements and any other needs you have from the software vendors. Certainly what I've found very useful is doing software vendor workshops earlier rather than later. I think making sure people understand what's actually available externally. If you think most people in organisations have worked in organisations for 5 to 10 years and probably use the same technology if that period, if not longer, a lot of people may not even actually have awareness of what a SaaS-based platform can provide from a user interface perspective. You then need to really build up the trust with your software vendor. So there's doing things like reference checks, whether that's industry-based, whether that's scope of transformation-based. It's really important that you build up that trust with your system, your software vendor, as you move forward in the process. And then finally, there'll be the negotiation and decision-making phase, which I'm sure we could probably do another podcast about entirely. It's really important that you understand exactly what you're signing up to with the software vendor. Most of these relationships, as I spoke to earlier, are going to be for a 10 or 15-year period. There's going to be a high level of trust involved. Having said that, in some cases, it will end up going back to contract as well. So it's really making sure you spend the time, things like getting external legal advice, to make sure the contract is fit for purpose, particularly if things ever get a bit difficult with the software vendor.
Just focusing on that specifically around that contract, we do see a lot of programs get paused because of that very point where prices just escalated. But what's your advice to organizations about getting the right pricing point and scope, but still having that flexibility for future needs, Daivd?
Yeah, I think it's very clear articulating what's in the current scope of the program. There can then be what we call optional items or future capability, but in the context of clearly documenting, be really 100% clear of what is in the current scope. And any of those additional items that are presented by the software vendors being really clear and articulated, that is that within the bill of materials that you're costing up for us? Or is that an additional or an over above in the context of a bill of material? Now, some of these conversations will be a bit challenging, but they'll be less challenging than if you have to go to the contract 6 or 9 months down the track and, as you spoke to, Jay, put a program on hold because you weren't clear up front what was in the scope and what's not in the scope of the program.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think an interesting point as well, and I'm interested to see kind of what you think about this, but we see a lot of the times we have, a vendor that's typically going to run the entire project, and they'll try and put, a project manager on that project as well to maintain everything. How important do you think it is to have someone on your side of the fence to keep the SI honest, to kind of make sure that things are moving in the right direction?
Yeah, so in my program at Line, and prior to that, I hadn't actually been involved in a program, certainly of the complexity of our sort of 3-year S4HANA journey. And what became apparent to me pretty early on was that at the end of the day, the system integrator or any external vendor will move on at a point in time. Yeah. And it's really important that the team understand that the system integrator has a highly important and valuable role, but they won't be the team that is left to explain it to the business, or the business are looking for in 2 to 3 years why either the functionality wasn't delivered, it was delivered too late, or not in line with requirements. So it's really the people on the program understanding their role, and their role is yes, to work constructively with the SI, but it's also to take the role as almost the governance for the company as you're rolling out this program. And certainly from a program director perspective, you've got to understand at the end of the day, you will have ultimate responsibility for the deliverable, not the system integrator. So you've got to be really clear in what they're delivering for you and what they're not delivering as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's well.
So Daivd, thank you for your time today. That's absolutely brilliant. There's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge there that I'm sure customers can pick up and implement and learn. One last question that I had before we wrap up the podcast. Obviously, you've been through transformations, you've got the battle scars, you've got the experience there. But if there's one thing you can pick out that you wish you knew before going into those transformations, which I know a lot of our listeners would be there, what's the one thing that you would suggest or you wish you knew beforehand?
Yeah, so we've already spoken to change. So I think to answer your question, I'll focus on a different issue, which is around the importance of data. So where these programs go wrong, it's usually down to 2 factors. One's change and the other's data. And also where I'll make it relevant to the S4 journey is someone moving, and we certainly found it on the Line transformation, when you're moving from old technology, which wasn't even ECC, it was actually an old mainframe system. But when you're moving to SAP S4HANA, there's 2 levels of data. There's firstly making sure the data in your current system has been cleansed. And that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. And let's face it, no one wants to come into the office on a Monday morning looking to cleanse data. The other key learning is when you go to S4 is generally there's actually more data. So there's not only data validation, new data needs to be created as well. So I wouldn't underestimate the level of both data validation required to move to S4HANA, but also the amount of data to be created as well. So that's the other sort of key learning I would share with the wider audience out of today.
Excellent. Daivd, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the S4 Do's and Don'ts theme and the Configure It Done podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Seb, thank you for bringing Daivd along. That was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daivd. It was good. I think a lot of the times we have a lot of conversations around, the do's and don'ts of S4 and, what they has, but that we never kind of look at what does it actually take from a ground up perspective, what planning involved. And you came out with a very meticulous and very well thought out approach. So thank you very much for your insights.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for the time today. I really enjoyed our chat.
Please like, share, comment and subscribe to the Configure It Done podcast.